Welcome to the Micronaut podcast. I am your host, Sergio del Amo. I am joined by Micronaut project lead, James Kleeh. How are you, James?
I'm great. How are you?
Yeah, excellent. A bit under the weather, but we're doing good. This is the second episode of the podcast, as we are recording on Friday the 5th, and we'll be releasing on Monday. We want to hit a bi-weekly cadence. So the idea is that every 2 Mondays, you should have a new episode of the podcast. The agenda section, it's good to have James, because one thing in the agenda is your talk in Madrid, Groovy User Group. When is the talk?
I think it's November 17th at I think it's 6 p.m. Central European, and so I think it's noon Eastern time. And yeah,
what to talk about?
Yeah, it's my first time talking to this group, and and so I'm really excited to be speaking there, and hopefully, we get a lot of attendance and people come check it out. I'll be speaking on Micronaut and AOP, right? So AOP being aspect-oriented programming. So Micronaut uses AOP, for basically everywhere for all of its really cool features, right? Like our declarative HTTP client, our the way you interact with Kafka, and all of our other messaging solutions, as well as WebSockets, and so it's used everywhere. And so the talk is going to be basically going over how does it work, and how can you write your own custom AOP, right? And maybe what some good use cases for that might be, and sort of demystify sort of the magic of Micronaut's AOP story, right? Because it's pretty easy to get started and pretty easy to do your own stuff, and more people should leverage it.
Yeah. So for anyone who has never used AOP, you probably have used a transactional in your Grace or your Spring Boot applications.
Mm-hmm.
So that's typically, what do we call that? We call that
a round advice.
The one that you will typically use in a method, right?
Yeah, the one where it's wrapping around some existing implementation. Right, yeah. So we kind of have a round advice, which is wrapping around something that's already there. And then we have introduction advice, which is we do the implementation for you.
It's pretty cool and really easy to get started and get dangerous. So I have a Puppet project that uses Pushover, which is this sample application to send yourself push notifications. And I created like an annotation that you can put in a method. And when the method gets executed, in the round advice, you get access to both method parameters and the return type, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you can go as crazy as you want.
Yeah, there's actually a really interesting API that we added, and a part of Micronaut 2, I think it was, that allows you to more easily interact with the method. So it's pretty easy to support things like completable futures and publishers and blocking types and everything. So you don't have to have a lot of the logic of, is this a publisher, is this a future, that kind of stuff in your actual code. It's all kind of abstracted away.
The talk is going to be in English, and it is going to be an online talk, and it is free. So please register. I think there is so Madrid Groovy User Group is my local group, is the group that I used to go outside of my house. For those of you working remotely before COVID, it's always nice to have like a user group where you have to drive a little bit and get out of your routine. And typically talks are in Spanish, but we have had English talks in the past, and when it used to be like local, we always had like between 20 and 30 people, so it was really nice. So really nice that you are joining us.
Yeah.
And for anyone the last one was also online, and I think Ivan, who is the organizer of the local group, he streams live. So if you want to ask questions to James, there is think it streams live in YouTube Live. Join us and learn about AOP, which is a pretty nice feature.
Yeah.
Talking about online streaming, we started one thing that we call Micronaut Live, and basically what we are doing is Tuesdays and Thursdays, 5:30 Central European Time, which is for US Central Time, I think it's 10:30. We are doing essentially. I started creating an application from scratch, and I am coding 1 hour Tuesday, 1 hour Thursday, and I am building an application to essentially the typical application that you will use to capture newsletter subscribers for your email newsletters. And we have covered, for example, creating the application, setting up GitHub Actions. We used, for example, yesterday we integrated the Micronaut Views, which is the module to generate the server-side HTML. We integrated Micronaut Security in a weird fashion because the application right now is completely unsecured. So one thing that we support since Micronaut 3.1, we support for you to use Micronaut Security but disable the Micronaut Security filter. But you can still use things such as JWT generation and JWT validation. And what I'm doing is I'm generating a JWT with the user's email in the claims. And when someone registers to the newsletter, the typical flow is that you receive an email and they tell you click a link to confirm. So that link is going to contain a JWT that the application receives and essentially validates. Using Micronaut Security is actually quite transparent because what you inject is a Micronaut type token generator. So if in the future you want to use something else than the JWT, you will be able to do that. And so anyone who is interested in hanging out in Twitch and discovering my audio problems, which I am having, I am quite new to this Twitch, so it's been quite an experience to understand the mechanics of the platform. Please join us. And with that out of the way, James, let's move to Level Up. So Level Up is this source section. My idea is to bring you a tip. In the last episode, we talked about URI Builder. And in this week, I want to talk about when you use Micronaut Data JDBC, which is probably the most, I think it's fair to say, the most exciting persistent story around Micronaut. You essentially, in your day-to-day, you are creating like methods in an interface, and Micronaut Data is doing the heavy lifting and is generating the queries at compilation time for you. But sometimes it's useful to like know what kind of query is being generated because you want to make sure that the generated code is as performant as you expect. And one really easy way to do that is to add a logger with the package io.micronaut.data.query, and if you add that with the level trace, you will essentially get like the SQL statement printed in your logs. One thing that I typically do is so Micronaut ships with logback by default, and when you create a new Micronaut application, we generate under source main resources. We generate a logback.xml file. What I typically do is instead of adding this line in the logback file that you're going to use in production, what I typically do is I create under source test resources, you can have like a logback.xml file, and that is used in the test. And I add that logger line there so that when I execute the test, I see the statement there. So check it out and let me know what you think, and hopefully you like it.
That's a really great tip, Sergio. Speaking of data JDBC being so exciting, I I spoke actually at a local user group like a week ago, and told a longtime acquaintance about data at JDBC, and he was very excited about it. And it was mostly to a group of non-Java people, and so I introduced them to Micronaut and GraalVM, and they were blown away by the 20 millisecond startup time and that kind of stuff. So it was a really positive experience overall.
Yeah, one nice thing that we are seeing in the stream in the Micro Life is, and it is a pattern that I see, is because for me it has changed completely the way I write applications, because it is so fast to test that I typically now I almost never run the application. So in the past, my flow would have been like write something, run the application, test it, and then maybe add a test. Now it is so fast to just write a test that I barely run the application. And if you see so we are uploading the recordings to YouTube for Micro Live so that you can watch it on demand. And you see it's like essentially almost never running the application. If you think that you are starting the server, configuring the access to the database, doing the inserts, doing the rollbacks within the test, and the thing is blazing fast.
Yeah.
Micro JDBC with microdata is really exciting, and I am sure we'll talk about it in...
Especially with the new announcement of Testcontainers Cloud. If you saw that, you can have have your containers in the cloud, and you don't even have to run them locally, right? Which should speed up a lot of test cases as well. It
will solve use cases for CI, but also I have a MacBook Air M1, and sometimes Testcontainer, I'm not the fault of Testcontainer, but the fault of Docker, was one of the last things that was like not working, as in an Intel machine. So that probably like gonna be like in their blog post they say that's like one of the motivations. So that's pretty exciting. We have to cover the integration with Testcontainer because we use it a lot. So we use it internally for all our modules. For example, I'm getting back to Microdata JDBC. We test in Microdata against many database implementations because we support like, so when you work with Microdata, you are like the dialect, right? So you say, I'm working with Oracle, or I am working with PostgreSQL, or with MySQL. And we have like tests that use Testcontainer and that test against all of those different implementations. And in security, for example, I think you actually wrote it. We test against Keycloak, right? Was this you, right?
Yeah. Well, that was a big challenge of writing an OAuth client library, is making sure that it actually works, right? So I'm not sure how else we would have done it without Testcontainers. So I was able to create a local Keycloak instance through Testcontainers and Docker, and configure it and get the client ID and secret out of it, right? And then use that to configure the application and then test OAuth, right? And so so that's one of the ways that we've made sure that our OAuth implementation, client implementation, actually works, right?
We have to talk another day about the security module, but let's get moving. So let me go to the next section. In the main section, I wanted to talk to James about how does the frame. So I wanted to use this episode, which is the second episode, so it's one of the early episodes in the podcast, to lay out some of the conventions that we use in the framework, so that people who are already using Micronaut or are new to Micronaut can understand how they can use the framework and how they can evolve their applications and grow with the framework, right? So we use semantic versioning. Can you elaborate for those who are new to semantic versioning what semantic versioning is and what it is for us?
Yeah, sure. So when Micronaut first started, we we came from our experience in Grails, which closely mimicked the versioning scheme that Spring Boot used at the time, right? And that sort of makes sense for Grails because Grails is based on Spring Boot, and Spring Boot did not use semantic versioning. And so when it came to Micronaut, we needed to come up with a versioning scheme because Micronaut doesn't really rely on very many third-party libraries, almost none, right, for just a base application. We decided to use semantic versioning, and the main reason behind using any versioning scheme in particular is just so that when people are using the framework, they can have some sort of base knowledge about what do the version numbers mean, right? And if I upgrade from 3.1.1 to 3.1.2, what can I expect, right? Users shouldn't have to go read the release notes to know, in general, the types of things that are going to be in those releases. And semantic versioning is the most popular. I think it's the most popular sort of versioning scheme that's out there today. And so due to its sort of large amount of people that are familiar with it, that's the one we went with. And so basically, there's a version is broken down into three categories. There's major, minor, and patch. Right, patch releases should only contain backwards compatible bug fixes. So even if there's a bug and it's if changing it means changing the behavior of something, then that's not backwards compatible, unless that behavior was like an exception, right? Like a problem. So the patch release should really only contain backwards compatible bug fixes. And then the minor version is where we put new features. So any new features that we want to add to the framework, or if we want to deprecate an existing feature, that only goes into to minor releases. And sometimes if we're not quite sure on a bug fix, we might put it into a minor release, right? If we think it won't break anything, but we're not maybe totally sure, we'll put it into a minor release. And then the major version is for breaking changes. So anything that breaks, typical usage of the application or changes in behavior goes into the major release.
And what's the cadence? So how often are we releasing a minor, a patch, and a major version?
So we're, we don't we don't sort of publish dates and say this is what it is and that's what it is no matter what. But in general, we try and stick to publishing a patch release weekly and a minor release every 6 weeks and a major release once a year.
So one thing that I wanted to talk to users is if you find a bug in a module and you create an issue and the bug is fixed, we will often release the module immediately.
Mm-hmm.
So if you need the bug fix, you often can force the module's version in your build. So Micronaut releases a BOM, a bill of materials. So that's the reason that when you generate a new Micronaut application, you don't have to specify each of the different modules version, right? So we generate in this BOM, we have Micronaut 3.13 plays well with Micronaut Security 3.1.4 and etc., right? But if you are interested in a particular bug fix or in a feature, so for example, if you are interested in a feature and the feature is coming in Micronaut 3.2 and you are too excited or you actually really need this feature to go into production, often you will be able to use the feature before the next minor is released, right?
Right.
So we use minors will include new features in core, but also will include all the minors of the different modules.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, new features of other modules as well. Yeah.
So for example, I was today merging one of your PRs that you added to to the Reactor module a Reactor WebSocket client, which we have considered a new feature, and that's already released, and it's a minor of the Reactor module, and that will be included in Micronaut 3.2, which essentially is the next minor of core, right?
Right.
My 2 cents for user is what we want for you to, and actually we strongly believe this is, if you are updating patch versions, you should never hit a breaking change. And we are being quite strict, and it's sometimes annoying in the PR reviews that someone in the team will come to you and say, watch out, this is a breaking change. So you will never find a breaking change in a patch or in a minor version. If there is a breaking change in a patch in a minor version, it's because we did a mistake. But intentionally, we will never do a breaking change until the next major version. And that's a pain for us as people like working in the framework, but we believe that this is really good for the people using the framework, because it should give them the peace of mind to be like updating their applications. They don't have like to, oh my God, we have to update the version, but let's take a couple of days just to make sure we updating a Micronaut application should be easy. Actually, what do you say typically involves to update a Micronaut application?
Just changing the version number in your build. That for a non-major upgrade, that should be all that you need to do. And you should have confidence that your tests will pass as well. Yeah.
Typically what I do as well is what James just said. So if you are like using Maven, you will find like the Micronaut version in the under project parent version. And if you are using Gradle, I think we ship the version in Gradle properties. Mm-hmm. So it's like a Micronaut version specifying Gradle properties.
Right.
One thing that I typically do as well is, so we have this Micronaut application which is used to generate Micronaut applications, which is Micronaut Launch. So if you go to launch.micronaut.io, you essentially generate archetype for the projects. And one of the things that we ship to build plugins, we ship actually more than 2, but we ship a Gradle build plugin, a Micronaut Gradle build plugin, and a Micronaut Maven plugin. You may be interested in upgrading the build version. So in theory, you shouldn't need to, and that's up to you. My recommendation is, what I typically do is I go to Micronaut Launch and I check if the Micronaut Gradle plugin version, if a new version has been released, and the same for Maven, right? So it typically involves 2 things: updating the Micronaut version, and I check if I need to update something in my build.
Yeah, actually, you don't actually have to do it for Maven, because Maven, the build plugin version is part of the. It comes in automatically when you update the Micronaut version, right? But unfortunately for Gradle, there's no way of specifying a build plugin version from a BOM. So for Gradle, you have to specify it separately. So, but the Gradle plugin should only contain, bug fixes and things like that. So I wouldn't feel pressured to update it unless you're experiencing problems, or if it contains, some changes that you're interested in.
The Gradle plugin is also distributed to the Gradle plugin portal, so it's like any other Gradle plugins that you may be used to. So I do this, for example, for the Micronaut Gradle plugin, but I will do this for, I don't know, the Shade plugin or any other plugin that you are using in your Gradle applications. So typically what I do is I visit the plugins.gradle.org and I check for whatever the latest version is and check if I am able to. That should probably be the only thing that users have to do.
I think the only other thing that I would do is, if I'm upgrading to a minor version, is take a look at the see if there's any warnings in the compiler about overriding a deprecated API, because we can deprecate things in minor versions. And so if you are overriding something that's now deprecated, you should make it part of your upgrade process to change to whatever the alternative is. I think we do pretty good at letting users know when something's deprecated, what they should be doing instead.
About that, James is 100% right. So what we typically do is, So again, we are being quite strict about generating Java docs for all the public APIs. So essentially, any class that is in a Micronaut module and that has a public or a protected method has Java doc. Same with the classes and the interface as a class level, I mean. And if, for example, what Jane was saying is, I'll give you an easy example. For example, I remember in a minor version of Micronaut Security, we added to a bunch of methods the HTTP request. So we added the same method, but we added the HTTP request as a parameter to the method. And we essentially deprecated the old one, and the new one was had a default that called the old one, right? And we add the deprecated annotation to the method we are deprecating, and in the Java doc we add the deprecated, and we tell you like use this other method instead. So if your ID is telling you that you are using something which is deprecated, click on that link, because it will tell you what you have to do instead, right? So we don't let you you don't have to check the release notes or anything like that. You have it there, right?
Exactly.
And it's always easier to do it in minors than waiting for the major, because in the major the method will be gone, right?
Yep.
So you are not gonna see the what you have to do instead, right? It's better to do it when the ID is telling you that the thing is deprecated.
Yep, it's definitely better to do it sooner rather than later, because it'll just make your upgrade to the next major version that much easier.
Do you want to talk about if someone wants to contribute to, for example, Micronaut Core, what's our branching strategy in the repo if they want to contribute a PR?
Yeah, sure. So for Micronaut Core, we don't have like a master or a main or any sort of branch like that. We just have branches that are named for the version that they represent. So we have 3.1.x, 3.2.x, 3.0.x, whatever it is. And the default branch of the repository is targeted towards the one where the next patch release, right? So that's the one that bug fixes and things should go into. So if you want to contribute a bug fix, it should almost always go into the default branch of the repository. And if you want to contribute like a new feature or something like that, first you should create an issue and propose it before you spend your time on it, right? Because there could be a lot of things to consider, and we don't want anybody's time to be wasted. So please create an issue and propose it, and sort of write it out what you think should be there and why and all that kind of good stuff. And then if we say okay, go ahead, we'd like to have a PR, then it would go into the next minor branch, right? So we're currently in the 3.1.x line, so it would go into it would target the 3.2.x branch. But it's quite, if for some reason it's not finished in time, it can always be moved up to the 3.3.x branch, right? That's not like it's not a big deal.
Yeah, typically so just to recap what Jason just said, we have is the same semantic version that we discussed before. The only part is that you have an X instead of the patch number. So that's basically the branch. So 3.1x is the current default, and 3.2x is the next minor. And we'll have 4.0x, which will be the next major.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm going to move to the next section. James, do you want to add anything about versioning or branching?
No, I just want to say that, we are not picky about contributions. We don't have a lot of requirements I'd say it's pretty easy to contribute to Micronaut. I think the only thing that requires that you sign our contributor's license agreement, which comes up automatically when you submit a PR. So please don't be afraid to submit changes to the framework. We welcome and appreciate everybody who is willing to contribute.
Yeah, we will do an episode about contributing, but actually what James said is 100% true. We have actually a lot of contributors. We have seen a lot of people submitting actually quite complicated features to the framework. So thanks a lot to you. And if you are thinking about something that you think it will be a nice feature to have, don't be intimidated. Really bring it up to discussion.
Yeah, I think we've had over 300 unique contributors to that.
It's amazing. And that's probably not including like everyone in different modules, right?
Right, that's just core.
Yeah. It's absolutely fantastic. Let me go to the next section. This episode is brought to you by our sponsors. Object Computing, which is our ambassador sponsor, Safri.net, which is our bronze sponsor, and also thanks to our community sponsors, who are individuals who support the framework through donations. Let me try to read the names out loud. So we have Corbinian Balg, Gis Loising, Lucas Morachet, Jem Weiss, Jeff Scott Brown, Danilo Marquez, Edgar Rios Navarro, Göran Erson, Andrew McKee, Balasu Brahmanayan Rengasamy, Philip Eisenbach, Hassan Mohudin, and Jason Siller. Thanks a lot to all of them. Apologies for my mispronunciation of your names in advance. And if you want to support the framework and make the framework possible, visit our sponsors page, which you can find in the Micronaut.io website. If you go to foundations, you can learn more about the foundation and about how to support it. And with that, let's move to the next section. Thank you. So in the last section of the podcast, we typically discussed some content that we have published in the previous episode. We have published actually quite a lot of content since the last podcast episode. We have this subdomain called guides.micronaut.io, which is where we have like step-by-step tutorials that show you a concept or how to do an integration of the framework. And typically this is, we guide you all the steps to create the application until a finished solution. You can download a complete solution, or you can like follow along and do all the changes. And we published a couple of guides. Let me actually open guides.micronaut.io. So we published a guide about, so we integrate with MongoDB, and MongoDB, we use the, I think it's the official Mongo Java client, and we published two guides. One that is if you want to use the sync version of the Mongo client, or another one if you want to use the async version. It depends from application to application. I was, for example, with a client that they were like using Mongo within a Lambda, so it didn't really make sense for them to use the async version. But if you are like using Mongo in an app with the native runtime, and you want to avoid having to like block and flag your code with a execute on, checks the async version, because that will basically give you like everything you need. We have another implementation with Mongo, which we don't have any guide yet, which is if you want to use Gorm for Mongo. If you want to like are building an application with Groovy and Micron, you can use Gorm for Mongo, and that's like more kind of this will abstract you a little bit more from the fact that you are using Mongo. Have experience with Gorm, that may be of interest. Then we published two guides, which are actually quite interesting. One is client credential flows with Amazon Cognito, and we published the same one with Auth0. This is an example of what we were discussing before is community contributions. We had an issue with using client credential flows with Auth0 because they require like some extra parameter, which is typically not like in the spec. And a user contributed a feature to Micronaut Security. For Micronaut Security, the version of Micronaut Security was included in 3.1, which essentially allows you to add like custom parameters to that request for the client credentials flow, and we wrote a guide showing the integration. And this person, who I am a terrible person because I forgot his name, he wrote essentially the feature in Micronaut security, and that's kind of a loop, a feedback loop that we are trying to do, especially with these security things, which sometimes you have to test against the third party to see that they are like 100% spec compatible, or they don't have anything on top of the spec that you have to think about. And for Cognito, the same. We have a guide which shows how to use client credential flow, which is a really useful flow when you want to communicate on a secure manner between applications. And Amazon Cognito is, I think it's free. I don't think there is any charge involved. So if you are on AWS, that's like a good option. And the last guide that I want to tell you about is we have in Micronaut we say that we are a foundation technology that you can create many kind of applications, and one of the applications that we have is functions. We support like creating functions against AWS Lambda or against Microsoft Azure, but we support also against Google Cloud Platform. We support like we have a guide which shows you how to use HTTP functions, which are essentially like, as the name said, functions that are invoked with an HTTP trigger. And the nice thing of Micronaut and functions, especially these functions that are HTTP triggered, is that if you want to, you can write as you will write a normal Micronaut application. What I mean is you will have controllers and methods annotated with @get, @post. And essentially, Micronaut, the Micronaut GCP module or the Micronaut AWS Lambda module, they will take care of bridging both worlds, right? They will take care of adapting between the Google Cloud Platform representation of an HTTP request to the Micronaut representation of a HTTP request and route the request to the appropriate controller. What that can enable is what some people are referring to as being cloud independent, or like having a smaller lock-in with a cloud vendor. I think that's a nice thing. And if you are like working with Google Cloud, check out the deploying an HTTP function to Google Cloud Function guide. And if you are interested in any new guide, let us know. In addition to Micronaut guides, with this we will wrap up the episode. We have this probably for another episode, but the Micronaut framework has documentation per module and documentation per core. That's like the reference documentation. The Micronaut guides is like in addition to the reference documentation, right? So we recommend you to check the reference documentation of the technologies that you are using. And the Micronaut guides is kind of like taking you by the hand and walking with you in an example to create a real application. And actually, we talked for 40 minutes, James. So it was longer than I expected. Do you want anything before we wrap up?
Yeah, I do want to sort of just add on to the guides thing. I think, our documentation is great, but it's definitely more for people who are already using the framework but are questioning how something works, how a specific thing works, whereas if you're new to the framework or you're just getting started, the guides are a much better place to look at, because it's much more of a new user-friendly sort of experience. So, but I think our documentation is very good, but it is it is more of, like I said, like a reference documentation. So if you're new to the framework, please check out the guides, and then once you're a little bit more comfortable, then you can check out the reference stuff.
Yeah, I do actually typically that, and that's, for example, something that I have been doing in in the Micronaut Live is I typically add links to the README file of my projects to the Micronaut modules that I am using. So because that's, as you said, that's typically like reference documentation. So for example, what you can expect in the reference documentation is we have like configuration properties. So we have like a configuration reference, we call it, where you have like all the configuration that you can use. We have like tables which are generated with real data. So they are always up to date, they are correct. So there are no like typos in those tables. And that's an excellent thing to have in your bookmarks because, as James was saying, this is something that you have to check, like, what's the name of this configuration, right? So sometimes you need to go to the source.
Yep.
With this, James, I'm going to thank you for joining me today. I'm going to thank everyone for listening, and we see each other in 2 weeks. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's been great.